What is it like to work in the highest positions of government service, but also be one of the youngest members to do so, and have not only that, but military experience, other nonprofit policy experience, and also be a prolific writer? Well, today we're going to find out. Andrea, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Teresa. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the Stories of Service podcast. And as I always do, I start every show with a intro from my father. So here we go.
From the moment we're born and lock eyes with our parents, we are inspiring others. By showing up as a vessel of service, we not only help others, we help ourselves. Welcome to S.O.S, Stories of Service, hosted by Teresa Carpenter. Hear from ordinary people from all walks of life who have transformed their communities by performing extraordinary work.
And as I said, today we are talking with Andrea Goldstein. She is a trailblazer, senior executive, intelligence and national security professional, and cross-functional organizational leader. From her years in uniform to shaping policy at the highest levels of government, she's dedicated her career to driving meaningful cultural transformation in some of the largest and most complex institutions in the United States. Former active duty officer, she served in diverse roles, including assignments aboard ships with the SEAL teams, and continues her service as a Navy reservist as a commanding officer. Her leadership is also extended to the legislative branch, where she played a pivotal role in drafting and passing the Deborah Sampson Act, landmark legislation improving services for women veterans. During her tenure in the Biden-Harris administration, she held senior executive roles at the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Navy, tackling critical issues impacting the nation. Her work has been recognized with numerous accolades, including the Department of the Navy Meritorious Public Service Award and honors from the Disabled American Veterans and Vets. And besides that, she is an award-winning writer, co-author of 3 books, and a member of esteemed organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Truman's National Security Project. A Pat Tillman Scholar, Andrea's academic credentials include degrees from the University of Chicago, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and the Naval War College. Welcome again.
Thank you.
So first off, I always ask my guests, where were you born and raised, and what inspired you to join the Navy?
I was born and raised in New York City. My family roots, at least in this country, are entirely in New York. My dad's from Buffalo, my mom's from Brooklyn, my stepdad's from upstate New York. And I was motivated to join the Navy primarily because of my Jewish background. First of all, one of the key values of Judaism is the value of tikkun olam, which is to repair the world. And I wanted to actively do something that I thought was important in making the world a better place. And the second was we take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And the First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees freedom of religion. And actually, that right was specifically highlighted regarding the Jewish community in a letter between what is now the Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, and George Washington, talking about religious freedom. So I'm alive because of the Constitution.
Right.
And I wanted to pay that back, pay that forward, whichever way you want. And I felt like actually wearing the flag of the country on my shoulder was the way to do it, especially at the beginning of my career.
Were your parents involved in advocacy or civic duty or service?
No, my parents are lawyers, although service to the community was something that was inculcated. So
Mhm.
doing good by to and by others was always something that I grew up with, being engaged. I mean, my parents always took me in the voting booth with them and taught me that voting is a habit. And just being engaged in the country, the community was always something that was something I grew up with.
Wow, that's really cool. I mean, my mom and dad didn't do a whole lot of volunteering or anything like that, but they were just very friendly people that didn't, especially my father, that didn't know a stranger. And it was one of those things where it was inculcated into me to just be a kind-hearted human. And so I think that just extended to my time in the service. So when you decided to join the Navy, I know that you are an intel officer. Was that the first designator that you picked as a reservist, or was there other thoughts about other communities, or how did that happen?
Yeah. So when I applied to the Navy, I applied to the intelligence surface warfare officer and uh, the to the cryptology community, which the name has changed a number
Mhm.
of times over the years.
Sure, sure.
Um, I actually think it was called information warfare then, which is the name of the entire community
Right,
now,
right, right.
to hide that they were cryptological officers, and I think they're called that again now. But,
Right, and then the
um,
intel officer
mhm,
community, like, I mean, the IWC
mhm.
community, I think if I'm wrong, correct me, but it encompasses a number of different designators too,
It
like
does.
crypties,
It does.
intel,
Hmm.
I
Meteorology.
IP, meteorology.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
awesome, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but the Intel was my number one choice. I had applied to intelligence positions in civilian government agencies with contractors that were going to be doing that sort of work. It was really the top of my list for what I wanted to do. And when I was accepted to be a Navy intelligence officer, there was really no question as to what else I was going to do.
Gotcha. So you're going along your Intel reservist career, and the way that I first became familiar with your work was through your writing. So tell me a little bit about how that got started. Your
Hmm.
career as an Intel officer, and then you decide to start writing, or did you get involved with an organization and then you wanted to write on behalf of them? Or tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was still on active duty because the first part of my career was active duty for 7 years.
Hmm.
I've been writing my whole life. I have journals that I think the earliest journal that I still have is probably from like the second grade. I always wrote short stories. Like I wrote a historical fiction novel about a woman soldier in the Civil War when I was like in the sixth grade. So it was always something that was really important. Maybe I'll revise it for publication at some point. But it was always something that was really important to me. And I kind of took a pause on a lot of creative pursuits when I first joined the Navy because I was trying to figure out what my identity was as a naval officer. And then after about a year or two, I was able to start to work in just who I was as a human being and merge that with who I was as a naval officer. And I had been involved, I'd won a couple of scholastic writing awards in high school and was really active on LiveJournal and actually had a friend that I met through that who tagged me on something on Facebook with a classmate of hers from high school who was starting this publication called Task and Purpose, which is now a major veterans and military online news source. Um, I was on deployment at the time. They were looking for writers. I sent them a writing sample, and they wanted me to come write for them because I was not only on active duty, but I was on a SEAL team working in a very sensitive job at the time. We agreed for me to write under a pseudonym. Um,
Why?
a
Was it
couple.
just because people didn't want you writing about certain things, or what was the? Yeah.
No, I was actually just about to answer that. So,
Okay.
it was actually because of my job. It wasn't because of there was any actually concern about what I was saying. Within a couple of months of me writing, my command knew that it was me. Everyone around me knew, and basically, I had a CEO who was like, "Just don't talk about Fight Club," and I wasn't. I wasn't talking about what we were doing. I wasn't talking about our operations. I was just writing about my life as a woman in the Navy and as a junior officer in the Navy and what it felt like to be deployed, what it felt like to be separated from your family. I think I wrote a little bit about how it felt to be disconnected from the Jewish community around the holiday, especially around the holidays. Um, and so folks who were around me who who were the kind of people who could have gotten me in trouble even though I wasn't doing anything wrong, but like my immediate people around me, they all knew that it was me. Um, so, but I stopped writing under a pseudonym pretty much as soon, like the day I left active duty. But that was
Mhm.
the real reason. It was because I was doing a sensitive mission. It was actually to protect the mission, not to protect me specifically.
I just remember, like, you came onto the scene and it was like, "Oh my gosh," like, because you would just you're very good at laying down your thoughts and actually putting out things that are very nuanced topics, and I remember thinking like, "Wow, like, there isn't that many people that really write this way." Um,
Thank you.
You're welcome. And that's why I always was sort of a fan. Like I always followed what you were doing, and that never stopped. That's why when I saw you at the
Thanks.
Joint Women's Leaders, you're welcome. When I saw you at the Joint Women's
Mhm.
Leaders, I was like, Andrea Howard. Or Goldstein rather,
Yeah.
not Howard. There's also
Yeah,
an Andrea Howard that I really like,
She's a friend
who's
of mine. I'm
who's
A1
also
and she's A2.
yeah. She's also kind of this on the same, but I've had
Yeah.
her on funny
Yeah.
enough, I've had Andrea
Mhm.
Howard
Oh yeah.
on my
Yeah.
podcast as well. And it was like one of those things where I was like, wow, there's really these very strong,
Mhm.
fearless women who are talking about their views and expressing themselves online. And I couldn't believe that was the case. And I've never been like a long form writer, but I've always
Mhm.
been somebody who wanted to express myself. And I just remember seeing what you were doing, and you were doing it before anybody was really that active on social media. Like you were doing this a
Yeah.
long time ago.
Yeah, like there was really I didn't start my Twitter account until I left active duty, but I still had a pretty good following, and I don't have Twitter because I stopped getting engagement on it, so I actually left Twitter 2 years ago. But people were just reading it. Like on just because that was what
Mhm.
Task and Purpose was putting it out, and it was really at the time there weren't a lot of active duty voices, and there certainly weren't women, and no one was really writing about this while actively serving. There were a
No.
small handful of women who were post 9/11 who were writing after their service, but there was no one who was writing about it during service. And I'm really I they're now, there's still, I wish there were more, but there's still like
Right.
there are now a good number of voices in the space, and I'm really happy about that.
Right. And writing is kind of sadly sometimes a dying craft because there's so much out there with the younger generation of putting out just video content or
Hmm.
doing like what I'm doing with a podcast. There really
Right.
just isn't a lot of people who can sit down and really write out their thoughts. So tell me about what were from the early stages of your writing career,
Hmm.
what were some of those topics that really resonated with you that you would just kind of revisit time and time again?
uh the thing that I keep revisiting actually is uniforms. um so here's how it happened. I just was writing about my experience. I wrote about what it felt like to be deployed, what it felt like to see like a meteor shower in the middle of the
Mhm.
ocean, and all of my experience of leadership and things people said to me and challenges. And ultimately, like, one of those challenges was uniforms, because they kept changing women's uniforms and only women's uniforms and only making women pay for them. And they were changes that nobody asked for.
Right.
And then we were stuck with the bill. And
Right.
also at the same time, like, I have wide hips
Mhm.
and relatively narrow shoulders. Like, I swam in high school, but I'm not super broad shouldered. So my combat uniform, the blouse doesn't close.
Right.
If I go up a size, the shoulders are too big. So it was things like that where the thing that I put on every single day that had my name on it and US Navy and the shoulder on then the American flag patch on the shoulder didn't fit me because it was so called unisex, but it was actually made for men, and we were putting women in it, and it was a message every single day that said, this place was not designed for you, and you don't belong here.
Yeah.
And that was that message every single day. And then the issues of changing women's uniforms with changes nobody wanted, and then making women pay for it, was once again this is a fixable problem.
It's
We should
easy.
not. It's
Yeah.
easy. It's
Mhm.
easy, and the dismissal of the concerns and the refusal to solve an easy problem of it again is an issue of trust. It's an issue of belonging. And
I
I
agree.
always thought about it of, if I'm being told I don't belong, how do I have the psychological safety to do my job?
Right. And I
Right?
mean,
If you're
these
getting
are
that message every single day.
this reminds me so much of the men and the beard issue because
Hmm.
to me, it's such a fixable problem. When you see
Exactly.
there are men in NATO countries who wear beards and
Hmm.
nobody bats an eye and nobody
Correct.
cares. I mean, you think to yourself, these are just simple, fixable issues that really go a long way in improving morale. And that's why
Exactly.
I was very like for the bucket cover. I was very much a fan when they both decided to bring that back because a lot of
Yeah.
women we feel a lot of pride in that cover,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
silly to make it the same. And I mean, you'll even talk to some of, I've been hanging out with some of these team guys last week, and they preach the importance of the female engagement teams. Like, that's a job that women are
Hmm.
specifically suited to do well, and they provide that to the fight. And so I think that that's so important that we account for those differences. Like, there, it's okay for us to be different, and it's
Hmm.
okay, and it's not only okay, we should celebrate those types of
Exactly.
differences.
I mean,
And
sometimes that's what makes us really good at our job.
right, no, I 100% agree with you. So tell me a little bit about, so you're intel officer, you get out, you're
Hmm.
now and the reservist, and then where do you go next for your kind of like along your career trajectory?
Yeah. So when I separated from active duty in 2016, I knew I was going to grad school. I'd gotten in early. So I got in, I found out where I was going in December of 2015. I got in, and so by March of 2016, when I separated, I knew I was going to grad school in fall. I did a little bit of a walkabout. I traveled around the world for 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I had no break in service, my reserve CO was fully supportive, and we pushed all of my drills to the end of the summer when I got back. Um,
Nice.
which was also really common because I was drilling in Newport, which is basically filled with JOs who just left active duty who are going to grad school in the GI Bill in Boston.
Okay.
So I traveled for a couple of months, and this is actually something that I tell my mentees, especially military, but otherwise, which is life affords you very few gaps, whether it's a couple of weeks or months or even a year. If life affords you a gap and you can afford it, take it.
Right.
Because I really needed that time to reset, and it was part of this, you know, starting over by choice and being really excited about it, and also figuring out how I was going to be all of the versions of me I'd been before and who I was going to be now.
Right.
So I immediately affiliated with the reserves. I joined a NATO unit, and then I went to grad school on the GI Bill, with also a Tillman scholarship starting in the fall of 2016. Um, yeah, so that was an immediate
Awesome.
next step. Mhm.
And so then when did you go into SES or DHA? How did those
Yeah.
two opportunities come along?
So my journey was, this is where my career kind of splits, because for the first 7 years, I was full time, 100% only in the Navy on active duty. And when I
Mhm.
went to grad school, because I immediately affiliated with the reserves, that path kept going. But then I had this split where I now had this parallel track happening exactly at the same time. So I got my master's degree, and I was working on issues at NATO that I was also studying, and I was kind of a little bit of a unicorn on those issues that I was working on, where DoD was just getting started and they needed some expertise, and they were looking to NATO and there was an American working on it. So I was working on that. I started leading a nonprofit right after I graduated. And by this point, I was already an established voice writing about these issues under my real name,
Mhm.
especially about like women veterans, service women, and issues of, um, belonging and, access to resources.
Right.
And so in January of 2018, 19, I was sitting in Rayburn House office building at like the end of January, waiting for a friend to go grab coffee. And I got this email that was titled Women Veterans Task Force. And the House Veterans Affairs Committee had created this job, and I looked at it. And at the time, I was actually about to go on long term reserve orders with NATO to work on something that would have been fun and cool to do. And so I was like, oh, that seems cool. Archive. And then the next morning, 6 people had re-forwarded me this job posting.
And it was like, oh, whoa, this is like kind of a message that maybe a
Yeah.
bunch of people are sending me at the same time. And
Yes.
this is, they're saying, oh, you would be perfect for this job, kind of thing.
Yes. So I applied, and actually, the day after my interview with the chairman, uh, my orders got canceled. So it was a sign. And 28 days later, I moved to Washington, D.C. And so I worked for 2 years on the House Veterans Affairs Committee,
Wow.
a little over 2 years. So I was on HVAC from March of 2019 until June of 2021. And I'm not the youngest SCS ever. And but there were two of us who were appointed relatively around the same time who were under 35. And what both of us had in common was Hill experience. And with the very small handful of other DoD SESs who were in their 30s, all of us had Hill experience prior because you're working on strategic issues already at a relatively young age. You have to have that big picture vision. And you're already at this very high level of government. So that is, and we were also in, two of them were national security advisors to senators. I was on a committee. So that's something that we all had in common. So that when the Office of Force Resiliency for the Department of the Navy had this new senior executive position, I was two people put my name forward for what's called a non-career appointment. And that's how I joined the senior executive service at age 34.
What is a non-career appointment? What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's typically a political appointee. So I was a political appointee in the Biden administration.
Mhm.
Sometimes non-careers do a conversion process and become career
Gotcha.
civil servants. So it is possible. And it that doing the career conversion wasn't for me. I actually really liked for me, it worked to be part of the dynamic of knowing I had limited time to work on what I felt mattered, and then also step away for the career civil servants who are the backbone of the federal government to take over. And so there are no political appointees anywhere near that office and haven't been for about a year and a half, I think.
Wow.
Mhm.
What in the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and then transitioning over to your time in the Department of the Navy, what would you say? I think I saw that the Deborah Sampson Act, but
Mhm.
what would you say? If you want to describe that, that's fine. But yeah, what are some of the
Yeah.
major landmark legislation or policy initiatives that you feel you're most proud of?
The Deborah Sampson Act is probably the thing I'm proudest of in my whole career. There's a lot that I'm proud of that I worked on uh, in in the Pentagon, but the Deborah Sampson Act was really this big culmination of my life's work, and I was working on it with um, the job was wonderful. Getting to be in the Capitol every day was amazing. I traveled the country talking to veterans. It was also, I was like coming up together with a bunch of veteran advocates that I'd known since before any of us were in DC. And I got to see the impact of it relatively quickly because I use VA for my healthcare.
Sure.
And so the Deborah Sampson Act is named after one of two known women who served in combat in the Revolutionary War. The other is Margaret Corbin. The New York City VA Medical Center is named after her. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and served in George Washington's army. She is the first woman whose husband actually received a widow's pension.
Hmm.
But both women also received pensions for their service after the war. And there's actually a floor speech that John Quincy Adams made about her, talk, talking about this is in the House of Representatives, talking about her service and the importance of women's engagement and civic participation, and talking about her as like the example. Because it wasn't just that, like she had lobbied for the benefits that she had the right to. So the bill itself is the most comprehensive legislation supporting women veterans, as well as some provisions that support all survivors of sexual violence who served in the military. Um, in at least this century, I think the legislation that created women's health providers uh, probably might be considered more expensive, but certainly at least in the 21st century, the most comprehensive. And it does everything between like authorizing some studies to mandating a comprehensive anti-harassment campaign throughout the VA. um, and you can see the results. If you walk into a VA medical center, you will see prominent signage talking about the values of respect, um, in that environment, as well as phone numbers to call if people are not behaving appropriately for
Mhm.
appropriate behavior in a medical center. And then there were some other pieces of legislation that didn't make it into the bill, like expanding mammography care, but was work that was being done at the same time.
Andrea, I remember you put out an article around the time this was being considered, and it was about a personal experience that you had
Hmm.
at a vet center. Is that, or a
Hmm.
VA clinic,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I had prior to my working at the House Veterans Affairs Committee, probably around, I think it was like January or February, and I started in March. Um, VA had been doing this research for many years and put out their own research that showed that about 1 in 4 women veterans were experiencing sexual or gender harassment in healthcare settings at VA medical centers. And it was anything from catcalling to things like, oh, you're too pretty to be a veteran, denigration of service.
Right.
They surveyed, I think, about 10 medical centers, and some were worse than others. So, like, the two worst facilities in the country, I think, were Washington, D.C. and West LA and Los Angeles.
Hmm.
But there was like, but in general, it was pretty common across the country. At the time, my first VA was Boston, and I'd had no issues in Boston. Or Albany, actually, for that matter, which was my second VA facility. But my third VA facility was Washington, D.C. And I had an instance where I was going, I've talked about, what happened. You can see what happened in the news. Like, there are plenty of accounts of what happened, but um, effectively, like, someone sexually assaulted me in a public place
Right.
in the VA medical center. Um, and what also really concerned me was that I reported it immediately and then got passed around to 3 different people. Like, no one knew what to do about it.
Wow.
So, which was also, like, also
Concerning.
concerning. So it's
Right.
like, you have this problem
Yeah.
and aren't doing anything about it. So I'm very proud to say that now, like, I still get my care from the DCVA, and it has done a full 180. Like, it's cleaner. There are, like, I don't feel unsafe in any part of the facility anymore, like I did when I first started going 6 years ago. So,
That's
um,
amazing. Wow.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a combination of, like, the legislation, the will, and I know, like, the director there worked really, really hard. Um, and uh, and also the Deborah Sampson Act made a difference between getting signed. It was signed into law in early January of 2021 and implemented, pretty much immediately.
Wow. Wow. So you went from the Veterans Affairs Committee
Hmm.
working there, I think House Veterans Affairs Committee,
Hmm.
and then you went to the Department of the Navy. What did you work
Hmm.
on at the Department of the Navy? Wasn't it like a sexual harassment or sexual assault task force
Uh,
or
that was
something
part of
along those
it.
lines?
Yeah.
Okay, part of it. Okay.
So, um, one of President Biden's priorities was to establish an independent review commission on sexual assault in the military, which was modeled after one that had taken place at Fort Hood after the murder of Vanessa Guillen. Um, and that IRC took place. And during the process, it was very clear that they were going to need a lot of support and implementation. And so I was hired during the IRC, but before the report came out. My first day was when the report came out.
Okay.
Um, so the job was sexual assault, sexual harassment, prevention and response, and suicide prevention and response, which later also included a comprehensive integrated prevention program, as well as the domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and family advocacy. Because all of these issues tend to have a lot of core underlying both risk and protective factors. So overall, the job was about resilience, about healthy command climate, about
Right.
belonging, all because, we're a warfighting force.
Right.
And having healthy command climates are how we're going to win.
Right. If you're not feeling safe in your environment, if you're not feeling safe at your workplace, you're not gonna be able to accomplish the mission. I mean, that's the bottom line on that.
Exactly.
So I see all these initiatives as things that we need to do, and we need to we need to continue to be important. And that's where I think and now we'll kind of transition to some of the things that I definitely want to get
Hmm.
into, like the women in combat and the DEI
Hmm.
and some of these other things. I do think that these are conversations that we're going to need to have openly, and
Hmm.
people are going to need to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because I believe that some of these conversations are incredibly hard to have, but they're incredibly important. So I'm going to start with the women in combat issue, because that's sort of
Hmm.
what prompted me to write you, because when I
Hmm.
saw what Pete Hegseth said about women in combat, which I think was taken out of context, but we can get into that. Um, then I saw your news piece on it, and then you and I briefly discussed back and forth the issues with gear. I was
Hmm.
really interested in kind of where you wanted to kind of go with that topic. And I think I'm going to start with asking,
Yeah.
do you believe that women, if do you believe that the physical standards need to be, number one, the same for combat arms positions? And if so, women should have an opportunity to compete, but if the physical standards they can't reach, should the physical standards change?
No, physical standards shouldn't change, and they haven't. The physical standards were rigorously set. And in fact, there were a couple of places where the physical standards were lowered. So or excuse me, raised. Their physical standards were raised. Because what happened was when in 2013 to 2015, when the when DoD was doing this comprehensive evaluation of the standards, thinking
Mhm.
about incorporating women into these roles, it was, why are you doing X or Y? Every single thing in training has to have some kind of tie to a mission, function, task of a combat unit.
Right.
So, so those standards were rigorously set, and the services, including the SEAL teams, which I served on as an intelligence officer, said, "Hey, if you can meet our standards, you're in." And there are no cisgender women SEALs, because to this day, there have been, actually, I don't even think any women have attempted to go to Buzz. There's one woman who was in the SWIC teams.
Right.
Um, right? So I don't really know what the fuss about standards are about, because the standards are high. The standards have been rigorously evaluated, and there are places where women still aren't serving because they have either not attempted or they
Right.
haven't met them. And there are also a number of jobs where there are a lot of women in those jobs now, because those jobs were open and there were qualified women who were ready to do them and who met those standards.
But okay, so I read in Pete Hegseth's book, and maybe it's completely wrong, and is that there were things that did go away. Like an example is in Army airborne school, they originally required everyone to do the run. Now, can I relate this one run to how that helps you jump out of an airplane? Probably not. I can't probably say, okay, well, do you think that everyone has to do the run because everyone has to jump out of the airplane? So I think that's what we have to look at. Like, that's just one example that's anecdotal.
Mhm.
But and that's all we're hearing right now. We're just hearing these anecdotal stories in training, that at certain people's trainings, that the trainings have been adjusted. And so people think that. So number one, we just have to clear the air on if that's happening or not. So we need to
Yeah,
be, you know what I'm
but
saying?
Yeah, but like, can people do the job? The standards have been set, they've been
Hmm.
evaluated, and people can do that, and some people can do the job, and some people can't.
Right.
I
So,
don't know, like, why this is a solved issue, and I don't know why we're relitigating it.
well, I think that the issue comes, and if I can play the other side, is the issue comes in there's certain jobs where there's going to be brute physical strength needed. So let's just say you're in urban street fighting, right? And your
Mhm.
comrade is dead in the street. Your 300, 200-pound SEAL built, fully built comrade is dead in the street. And now you are in the street with them fighting.
Mhm.
And are you going to have as a non-strong man that couldn't meet the physical standards, let's just say, or a woman who couldn't meet the physical standards, are you going to have the same physical strength? And if we only want to have the most physically, I'm not talking mental. Everyone knows that women can be pilots. Everyone knows a woman can do any other job other than ones that require brute physical strength. And so that's the only part that I'm hung up on in my mind. And that's why I really wanted to have this conversation with somebody that was on the other
Yeah.
side,
I mean, I
because how
know
do you do
men who
that?
can't do that, and I know women who can, and I know women who can't do that, and men who can. And the women who can do, like, I don't understand why anyone would want to fight with one hand behind their back. You keep the pipeline open, and the people who can meet the standards can do the job, and the people who can't meet the standards don't. And it's that simple. So I just don't understand
Yeah,
what all the hand wringing is about, right? Like when
right.
I was 26 years old, I could lift a
Sure.
200-pound man over. Like I'm 38 now, I've got back injuries now, right? Like it just, but and but I could at the time. And I still
Well,
know women who are my age and older who can, and men who
yeah,
can't. And there was like, I served on a team where I'm 5'7". I served on a team with a SEAL who was 5'3",
right.
right? Because he could do the
Yeah,
job.
I would agree with your point that there are
Hmm.
men that will not meet the physical standard as well. There's men that are not going to
Hmm.
be as strong as other men. I do believe, though, that on average, men, if you just took the whole collective and you looked at things like muscle
Hmm.
strength, bone density, all these other things, like let's just say physical things,
Hmm.
you will find that on average, men are physically stronger than women.
We're
Usually, not
not
always.
looking for, but this is the thing, Teresa. We're not looking for an average. We're looking for exceptional. 1% of this country serves, and 1% of those are like in soft, for example. Every
Right.
single one of those people is exceptional. It's the same with elite athletes. Every single one of those, they are elite athletes. Every single one of those people is exceptional. So averages don't matter when every single person that you're looking for is exceptional. I want every single one of those exceptions to be able to do the job and
Correct.
have the opportunity to do the job,
Yep.
right?
And there's
So
not
if
going to
we,
be that many people. There's going to be this just
right?
because of interest, because of,
Exactly.
all these other reasons.
Exactly.
Women, there's a reason why that we don't have, let's say, a good one is I'm watching a show called Line Man right now with
Hmm.
Billy Bob Thornton. And there's, a, again, it's in the movie, but I would imagine that it's somewhat like real life. There's probably not that many women who are working the patch, who are out there. I've watched these videos of what these guys have
Hmm.
to do to move the oil rig
Hmm.
to bring up the oil. It requires this insane amount of speed and brute physical strength. And
Hmm.
when I see something like that, I go, I'm going to bet there's probably, like you said, maybe a superwoman, maybe a gladiator that can do it. And in all fairness, there might be
Hmm.
that one gladiator. And it's so funny because I had this exact same conversation with Bill Brown, the Navy SEAL, and I said the same thing. I said, "There's got to be that one woman that can do it." And he kind of just goes back to, well, I think it's something we need to study. And I say, yeah, I say, let's look at what the women are that are currently rangers, that are currently in infantry, because we've had, I think I read it was something like 500. I don't know the exact number,
Hmm.
but there are women who have gone through ranger
Hmm.
school, who have gone through infantry school, who are green beret, who I believe are green berets. Again,
Yes, there are women
somebody,
Green
right?
Berets.
There are women green berets. And that has been since the combat exclusion law went away in 2015. So if that
Hmm.
is the case, why haven't we said, and this would just clear the air, Andrea, why haven't we studied that? Why haven't we looked at these women and said, okay, have they had urban street fighting? Have they done the same things that the people in Israel and Ukraine are doing? And then
Hmm.
another piece to this is, haven't we studied the way women in combat are employed in Ukraine and Israel? And are we taking lessons learned from them? So that's also where I think this discussion about women in combat needs to happen. Like, people just need to be educated on like what is currently happening, and then we can go further and say whether or not this even has to be discussed again.
So I would reframe it this way. I think we always want to understand what's going to be making our units most effective.
Mhm.
And I don't think that we need to be limiting this to women have been fighting in combat units since the dawn of time,
Sure, in support positions,
right?
yes, yes.
No, in combat positions since the dawn of time. Deborah Sampson pulled a bullet out of her leg so that she wouldn't be discovered in a field hospital, right?
Right.
Like, there are more than 500 women who disguise themselves as men to fight in the infantry in the Civil War. Now, in support positions, the number is even greater, right?
Right.
And a lot of
Okay.
these women were disguised as men, so you don't like you only really knew them if they got caught.
Right.
Or it was like a family secret, and with a handful, they were like Deborah Sampson went on an interstate speaking tour after her service, so that's how we know so much about her. It's the George George C. Marshall actually studied this, and I can send you the link to the research on this if you want to include it in the show notes. During World War II, George C. Marshall actually commissioned a study for the Army on the effectiveness of women in combat. And he was specifically was study looking at British units, and he also studied women only doing positions and mixed gender units, and men only, and found that the mixed gender units, this is 1943, found the mixed gender units were the most effective, and then just buried the study because it considered the American people weren't ready for it. So we've actually been studying this for a long time. I would look, if you want to study something, I would look at what's working really well, what's not working, but looking at it from the standpoint of we shouldn't do this when
Right.
it's already been happening for centuries.
Well, I would say look at it.
The difference is that it hasn't been acknowledged. Women and the issue that seems to be the concern, and I found this when I was serving in the SEAL teams, was the concern wasn't over women doing the job. The concern was over women having the military occupational specialty and the career path. And so then at that point, like, what is it actually about?
Yeah, I can't speak to people being concerned about the career path because that's not the concerns that have been shared with me.
Hmm.
Gosh, I spent a really good amount of time over Christmas break talking to my audience about this issue and looking
Hmm.
at it from different angles and gathering feedback. And I don't buy the cohesion issue. Like you could call any unit a problem with cohesion, right? Like when
Hmm.
women went to ships, they oh my god, we're not going to be able to drive ships, you know. So I don't buy that. The
Hmm.
one thing that always has held me up from going, yeah, it totally works. And again, I'm talking about something that I've never seen or experienced. So let's just start there. Like I haven't I'm not on the front lines in Ukraine. I'm not on the front lines in Israel. And I really would love to know how they're
Hmm.
integrating women and how women have done in, again, I'm using a very specific example of like close urban combat situations, not the sniper, not the drone operator, not the
Hmm.
intel officer, not the PAO. I'm looking at it from a very narrow standpoint. And I don't know if when Pete Hegseth gets confirmed, if he's going
Hmm.
to revisit that. I think what he's trying to do is just have a discussion about whether or not it's been effective. And if it has, great. Let's let that opportunity play out where his advisors and the people that are working for him have that discussion and look at all the women who are already serving, like you say, in combat positions, in combat zones, and let's see what that it's a non-issue.
Yeah.
And that's the, you know,
So Teresa, I have served in those units and I have served in those missions, and I have also advised the Israeli General Staff G1. And there are a couple things that I can tell you. There are a lot of women who have been doing these jobs and meeting the standards while serving in some other kind of military occupational specialty. When I was in the teams, we actually had a me talk officer, who absolutely met the physical standards for SEAL, and was doing her job at the same time as effectively having to do a SEAL job. She was actually given the opportunity to go through buds, and she declined it because she liked doing her job. Um, and then similarly in Israel, the Israelis actually had no concern about women doing the job in combat. All of their questions were about mixed gender units, and their concerns were actually because they have a lot of like Orthodox and people who have religious,
mhm,
like have a lot of religious restrictions about being
sure.
around women. But it actually had nothing to do with the actual mission and serving in combat. And at that point, we've already talked about the unit cohesion issue.
Right. And I'm
Right?
on board with
So,
that. That
yeah.
it not that it
So,
that it can be worked through. Yeah.
yeah. And for me and for my colleagues, like my women colleagues, the actual single biggest detriment was constantly being doubted and denigrated while trying to do this job on behalf of the nation. It had nothing to do with physical strength. Um, And actually for us, if you're an enabler, you get less training, you get less time on the range, you get less time learning how to fast rope, right? So you're actually ending up doing the job. And this is where I say, well, there's a higher standard because you're expected to do it with less training.
Right. Because of the fact that you're an enabler. Yeah. I
Mhm.
agree. I mean, I was a
Mhm.
quote unquote enabler when I was at Just Soda P, and
Mhm.
can say that it's definitely one of those things where you're kind of like working with one hand behind your back because you're not in the teams, but you're expected to
Yeah.
do all the things that the teams are doing. But I will say that I guess I just want to see it. I haven't.
Mhm.
I really would love women who have been like not, and again, in close urban fighting combat
Mhm.
situations to tell their stories more. And I think that that's what we're missing. And if there's
Yeah.
ever going to be debate about this, those are the kinds of testimony and the hearings that we need to have to just
So
put this
they
issue to bed.
have the the CSTs, the FSTs, which are the model on the SEAL team specifically, they actually had a much longer training pipeline. um the female engagement teams, women who were just serving in their job that was not a women's specific job and just happened to be with a unit, when it's never going to be enough for people who just feel insecure about having women there. Ultimately what it comes down to, this is what I believe, is there some people who feel very threatened by the idea of a women doing what they think of as being a man's job. Because if you are raised to think that women are inferior, when you see a woman being able to do the same job as well or better, it can threaten that core identity.
Or do you think they
And
wanna
that's
protect women? Do you think that that's part of it? Do you think that there's this instinctual need from a man to say, "This is a woman, I wanna make sure she's protected." And then if you've got a woman on the front lines that's bleeding out, because I will tell you, I sat next to a SEAL on the way
Mhm.
home from the tenant testimony, and he said, "I can never unsee watching a pilot bleed out, a female pilot." He said it was the most horrifying thing he's ever seen in his entire life. And he said he can't unsee it. And he has, PTSD for life. And I wonder if there's this I mean, I know what you think might be discrimination and them thinking
Mhm.
that we're inferior. I don't know if that's always what it is. I'm just offering this up. Do you think it could be because a man is instinctually driven to protect women? And when he sees a woman go down, it's this just crazy instinctual drive that takes over to want to step in and do something. And
Yeah, when those same men stop sexually harassing and sexually assaulting women in the service, I'll believe it. But I just don't. Ultimately, we train like we fight, and um, it's really, really difficult um, to see anybody that you love. I'm talking about this band of brothers, band of sisters, suffering and going down in combat, but. Uh, if we're training to do a particular job, it's not like you're gonna fight like you train.
right,
And I was trained in a mixed gender environment. Uh, so that's actually one of the reasons why the SEALs in particular had women in their entire training pipeline versus being like the Army, which the women didn't even show up till they were already in country. And on the SEAL teams, women did the full training pipeline with them, so that they were fully integrated, and you're not going to have this situation where you might have someone react differently.
right. Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see, like, I think this may play out. It could just be that it's never revisited, and this was just part of some of his beliefs when he was writing a book. And he's even said that, there's the difference between the beliefs when you
Hmm.
write a book and there's the job that you have to do once you're in the seat. And
Hmm.
we'll just have to wait and see how this one plays out. I am not decided on how I feel
Hmm.
about it, but I do know that there's a lot of people who are obviously still wanting to talk about it, and they're still wanting to understand more what this means, and where we are with the issue. There is the 2015 Marine Corps study in
Hmm.
boot camp, which found, according to the study, and I've read bits and pieces of it, and that women on average suffered far greater injuries than men. And that could be due to the gear issues that I know you and I said we were going to discuss. So tell me a little bit about how you
Yeah.
feel about those.
Yeah, so that study is 10 years old, when we still weren't issuing gear specifically for women. Um, I, I've been playing sports my whole life. I was issued a well, not issued. I say it like playing ice hockey, man. I was
Right.
issued something, right? We're talking about military stuff. I've had women's hockey equipment since I was like 12.
Mhm.
I never got women's body armor. And if you go backpacking, like there's you can get equipment at REI that's made for women. The weight distribution is different. You're going to be carrying the same amount of weight, but like women's bodies can do incredible things. We're just built differently than men from the standpoint of like when you look at endurance, exposure, like endurance sports. There are actually a lot of endurance sports where women overall can do better than men. And in things like long distance backpacking, you're going to be carrying the same amount of weight, but women, it's a lot better to distribute it to your thighs, to your legs, versus onto your hips, which is a little bit easier for men. So there's some of that. You also have to think about like what kind of environment people are growing up in. Right? Like I grew up playing sports. And this is actually something I talked to the Israeli general staff about because they were asking about, the pipeline. And I told them that one of their fundamental differences is that girls in Israel grow up knowing they're going to be soldiers and they can envision themselves as soldiers. A lot of girls in the United States don't grow up
No,
with that, right?
not at all.
So, right. And I grew up in the environment that I grew up in, all girls played sports. There wasn't really like a gendered division of the sports they play. Where I live in upstate New York, like girls are funneled into cheerleading and boys are funneled into football. I see that changing a little bit now, but in general, like a lot of it is it's also very possible that coming into that environment, coming out of high school, girls may have had less athleticism, less opportunity to train. um, if you actually start to look at some of um, the pre ranger school pipeline from when women first went through in 2015, the reason they did that was to already have women at a particular athletic standard before they started the training.
Mm.
So there are a number of factors that might contribute to higher injury rates, but like being a woman is not going to be one of
No.
them,
No, I
right?
would agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing about that study too, I think I saw
Hmm.
Kate Giramo
Hmm.
comment on this, and it's
Hmm.
the idea that when they did do the testing, they were
Hmm.
testing people that had no that were not in
Correct.
peak
Exactly.
physical
Like
strength. They were
the
not.
men were in peak physical strength. They were in the jobs. The women weren't.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't know the
Yeah.
men were. I thought it was
Yeah.
just everybody was
Oh,
kind of this on the same fitness level. But I think on average, if a man is out of shape and a woman is out of shape, right? Let's just say in
mhm,
this age group, um, averaging out, women are probably not going to perform as well physically
mhm.
because of the bone density, because of the muscle mass, because of these physical, biological differences between men and women.
Yeah.
However, like you said, if there are women that can meet that physical standard because they've built
Mhm.
themselves up to a certain
Right.
point to be physically strong enough to compete in those positions, then how do you not give them those opportunities?
Exactly.
That is your argument,
Exactly.
and
Yes. And
I
they're
can get I
also,
can understand that.
yeah, and in general, I'm also seeing like there are so many young women who are lifting weights in a way that even women my age were not when we were like late
Right,
teens, early 20s. Because we grew up in the 90s where it was like waif chic. If lift weights, you're going to bulk up, which just like
right.
um, you know, it's not true. We like put on muscle differently than men, and B, also like it's not waif chic anymore. So they're also just I see like a lot of women who are really, really fit in a way that just like if I go to a
Yeah,
gym where there are like a lot of young Marines, I just see women working out in a way that young Marines were not exercising in 2009.
Right. Right. Well, it is going to be interesting to see, as we say, how this issue plays out. Because, like I said, I definitely think that if people can perform to the standards and meet the standards, they should have the opportunity to do that. But the standards need to be matching what like you said, the occupational standards of the
Mhm.
position. And that was my argument even going into this and making my decision that I was going to support the SecDef. All of those things. I always went into it with that argument, and I didn't get any pushback
Mhm.
from the spec ops community on this point. I mean, we didn't probably go down as granular as you and I are right now, but it wasn't something that they disrespected me for having that position. And I think that's the part that I also respect about being a part of what I've been a part of this
Mhm.
past month, is the fact that I can have my own view on it and see it a certain way, and they can see it another way. I will tell you, a lot of them don't believe that women belong in combat arms positions altogether. But when I go and I walk down the path that I'm walking down with you, I generally don't get a lot of pushback on this, other than, like you said, some of the more stereotypical responses about being protective and unit cohesion and things like that. And I can understand those arguments. I can,
Mm.
because it is harder when sometimes you put men and women together who are not with their significant others and are at a certain age group or whatever. It is harder. I mean, I've seen it. It happens, but that
Yeah,
doesn't mean that you don't work together and you find a way to work through it. And good leadership trumps a lot of that. Like, good leadership can
exactly.
sniff out a lot of those
Exactly.
problems and
Yeah.
mitigate them.
Good leadership makes such a big difference. The way we train makes such a big difference. And since we were talking about these studies, I want to bring this back to a point that we talked about earlier. Where we're talking about sometimes the difference is actually something that makes your team really good. So during those Marine Corps studies, they actually found something really interesting, which is that the way women were getting over obstacles differently than men. So if you envision like having to get over a wall, men typically were just like doing a pull up and using just their pure upper body strength to get
I'm going to
over.
put you on full screen just so you can explain, because you're using your
Yeah.
hands.
So, and you can see my kitchen, my unaesthetic kitchen behind me. So, like men were basically trying to do a pull up to get over the wall. Women were not only using that, they would swing their leg over and use their full body strength to get over this obstacle. Well, what's the thing that you need to do? The task is to get over the obstacle.
Yeah.
And women had a more creative problem solving way and presented a different way of getting over the obstacle than the men did. But they still did it.
Yeah, I had that same problem actually in aircrew
Mhm.
school. In aircrew school, I got held back because of the wall. I'll never forget it. I was
Mhm.
19 years old and I was trying to go through the whole obstacle course, and I could do
Mhm.
every single thing but the wall. And it took somebody teaching me how to hook my leg, the top of
Yeah.
my leg, and then use the part on the top of my leg to just basically push myself
Yeah.
over, and then I was able to complete it. So
Yeah.
I
That's how
I
I do. I have super long legs. You do a kipping pull up, you throw your leg
right,
over, and then you get over
right,
the wall.
right. Right. So, all right. Well, like I said, thank you for having this conversation with me. I think it's really important. Now, how do you suggest? Okay, I got another zinger
Mhm.
for you, because I love
Okay.
this stuff. Love going back and forth on these things. What do you do about the fact that there's going to be so few women, right, that get in these combat arms
Mhm.
positions, and then now you've got to specially make gear? Are you just going to say, you know what, military, suck it up and pay for it? Because
Yeah.
how do you solve that issue?
So that's fortunately that's actually not a problem because the gear that's used is going to be used across the whole community. So for example, I actually got to try on the prototype for both Army and SOF's body armor, and they're actually modular. So they're not just made for women; they're made for people who just have different body shapes. Like the
Right.
body armor that we have is not great for short men. It might not be great for, so it's actually not specifically made for women, but the way that it's modular can be made so that it's better for women. But a lot of this gear is going to be issued across the community, not for specific job type. So you don't really run in that's we don't really run into that issue because, for example, like there are a good number of women in SOF. Some of them are serving in combat support and some of them in enabler positions. And yes, there are some, the Navy has one, although the Navy also has women in EOD.
Right.
Um, right? And so the gear, like I have fins, I have a wetsuit, like I still got all the same gear 10 years ago as an enabler as the SEALs were. I think the one difference was like I had a different helmet.
Right. But you didn't have any issues getting things that fit or things that weren't made for you, that was only made for a man or any of those kind of
I
things.
had a couple of issues. Like it was again, I'm 5'7", so it was a little bit easier for me than a woman who's like 5 feet tall. And like I mentioned,
Sure.
we had a 5'3" SEAL on the team, and he struggled.
Right.
Like the stuff
And
fit me actually better than it fit
yeah.
him.
And they have these problems in aviation too. I had
Mhm,
Jessica Ruttenber on my show, and she's
mhm,
a big advocate for women in aviation. And I didn't know this, but many of the combat aircraft are not fitted for a certain height, and women
mhm.
just traditionally are shorter. So
Right.
you actually are cutting off the talent pool of women who might otherwise decide to become a
Mhm,
pilot just based on the fact that you're not making the gears and the controls a certain size. And I
mhm,
found that to be fascinating. Like it's something that you just never think about when you think about that issue. So no, I really appreciate us kind of going down this deep dive. So let's circle back to kind of where you're at now
mhm.
with your career. So you did
Yeah.
the SES job, then you went to DHA after SES.
HHS. So
Health and Human
um,
Services. Okay,
yeah, yeah. So I was the principal deputy assistant secretary for administration there. So my job was like all the kind of internal operations, the things that make the agency run.
gotcha. And then then what happened? Then did you transition to
Yeah.
being more of a full time writer, or what's going on now?
Yeah, so like I said, like I tell my mentees sometimes, and I'm excited to share this with your audience, is sometimes if life's going to afford, if you get a gap, take it.
Yep.
I had an opportunity to just take some time off. I knew um, at some point I really just needed to take a sabbatical to think about what I wanted to do out of government, if I wanted to go back into government, and just spend time with family and write and travel. So I took a year off. I wrote, I traveled, I wrote a novel. I re-met the love of my life, who's
You
recording a
seem so
podcast in the
happy,
next
by the
room.
way.
Thank
I
you.
do want to say that you just seem you're like glowing. Like you're just there's a different like when I met you before these years ago, you're different now. You are.
Thanks.
You're just
Thanks.
different. So I get it. I get it. That sometimes that's where life takes us. And you do have a Substack, and you write very prolifically on that Substack. In fact,
Hmm.
I'll pull it up here so that people can see it. I think I linked to it in my what do you call it, the other tab right here so people can see it. But tell me
Thank you.
about like what are yeah, absolutely. Tell me about some of the things. Let me do this. There we go.
Yeah.
What are
There you
some
go.
of the things that you write about in here, and what are like how do you decide like what the topics are? Because it seems like you're writing like every day in here.
Yeah. Yeah. This week I've been busy this week.
Yeah. Yes.
Normally it's like once or twice a week.
Uh-huh.
So it's veterans. So this article, for example, is the impact of the hiring freeze on veterans because,
Yeah.
right, hundreds of thousands of veterans work in the federal government. 30% of the VA workforce are veterans, and then certainly, anyone providing healthcare in the VA is a federal employee. So um, this outlines my concerns about a number of issues related to VA that have come up this week. So I
Right.
typically write about veterans, personnel policy, issues related to national security. In this article, I talked about, uh, DEIA and actually my story of how I became an advocate for DEIA, which is actually a lot of things we talked about. I just like to win in the mission,
Right.
right? I'm a warfighter and I like to win, and I want to get the best people in the job and eliminate the barriers to them getting in the job. I like artificial barriers.
And I think people are
Yeah,
very confused about the word DEI.
yeah,
I
right.
think
I think,
it's become just like this lightning rod word
yeah.
that isn't that some people think it's affirmative action, and then other people think it's diversity and inclusion. And so people are on either side of this issue. And so the people that think it's affirmative action and don't believe in
Hmm.
affirmative action say down with DEI. And then the people that think that DEI is equality, they want it. But if you talk to, like I said, like these guys I was hanging out with last week, they're all about equality. They're all about making sure that everybody has a chance to compete, not that
Yeah,
everybody has a a price in the door, no matter what they do. They want that to
right.
be based on merit. But then
Yeah.
So
which is what we have. And so what this actually talks about is this is talking about the mindset of like, what are we actually talking about and what do we actually care
right.
about in this case, right? So that's what this is about. So I talk about some of those things. And if you go back, actually, I spent a week talking about my favorite moments
Oh
serving in the
yeah, you
Biden
did.
administration,
Right here. Yeah.
and what we accomplished during that time. I spent one post just talking about all my friends and the really cool moments of like getting to go to the White House to see the holiday decorations
Sure.
and lighting a menorah with the vice president and second gentleman on Hanukkah. And
That's really cool.
they also taught, but so it's national security issues, talking about belonging and veterans and personnel policy and free theater tips. I also am a huge theater nerd, so I also give free theater tips. So there's
I
actually a
love it.
post coming out tomorrow about 5 musicals that I think are appropriate for the moment.
I love it. Well, Andrea, people can find you on Substack. They can find you on LinkedIn.
Hmm.
As we're kind of winding down the call, is there anything that I didn't cover down on, or anything that you want to also address with our audience that we didn't have a chance to talk about?
I think we had a really great conversation, Teresa.
So
So
did
thank you for
I.
having me.
I really enjoyed talking to you. And it just goes to show you that, like, you can, when we celebrate the things that we have in common and the ways in which we're alike, and I mean that not just me and you, I mean that as humanity, we are so much stronger. I mean, gosh, it's just interesting. It is so interesting to me that when you just get down and you get to know people on a human level, things are just so different. And so I thank you so much. I will meet you backstage. I'm just going to go full screen here for a minute and say goodbye to my audience. But thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that wraps it up all for today. Thank you so much for joining us on the Stories of Service podcast. Always love talking with you guys. Next Tuesday, I start my friends, family, and returning guest special edition. So this Tuesday, I'm having Rebecca. Gosh, I don't want to say her old last name because she actually corrected me when I put it in the calendar invite. But I called her Becky growing up, and she knows me like nobody's business. And just can't wait for you guys to meet her. And she actually designs homes for a living. She's an artist. A lot of my friends were creatives that I grew up with. So just really excited for you guys to meet her and have a great conversation. And then, of course, I've got my normal show Thursday. So stay tuned. As I always end these calls, please take care of yourselves. Please take care of each other and enjoy the rest of your night. Bye-bye now.